I want you to picture something. A quiet street, a modest house, a man on his porch every morning with a cup of coffee. For 11 years, that man was me. My neighbors knew me as the quiet guy with the rose garden, the one who waves and minds his business. I wasn't looking for trouble. Then one Tuesday morning, my new neighbor arrived. He pulled up in a $100,000 SUV, looked at the empty lot next to my house, and decided my piece was just an inconvenience to his plans. The noise started the next morning, 6:15 a.m. Jackhammers, trucks, engines, dust clouds swallowing my garden. I gave it a week. Then I walked over, calm and respectful, neighbor to neighbor. He didn't even look up from his blueprints. "Do whatever you want," he said. "You clearly don't know who I am." Those 11 words changed everything. Because what came next revealed who I really was.
It started on a Tuesday in late April. I remember because I just finished pruning the roses when I heard it. A convoy of vehicles rolling down our quiet street like something out of a military operation. Flatbed trucks, excavators on trailers, a fleet of pickup trucks with construction company logos. They pulled onto the vacant lot right next door, the one that had sat empty for years, overgrown with wildflowers and visited only by rabbits and the occasional fox. I stood up slowly, squinting through the late afternoon sun. A black Mercedes G-Wagon was parked at the edge of the property. A man climbed out mid-50s, tailored white shirt, dark sunglasses, the kind of tan you get from expensive vacations. He surveyed the lot with his hands on his hips like a general inspecting a battlefield. I'd find out later his name was Preston Hargrove, real estate developer, net worth somewhere in the 9-figure range according to the business press. The kind of man who collected properties the way other people collected baseball cards. I didn't know any of that yet. I just watched him watch his workers, and I had a quiet, sinking feeling in my stomach. The kind that tells you something is about to change. The next morning at 6:15 a.m., the jackhammers started. I sat up in bed with my heart pounding, certain for a moment that something had exploded. The sound rattled my windows, shook the framed photos on my bedside table. My coffee mug jittered across the kitchen counter. The ground itself seemed to vibrate. Day 2, same thing. Day 3, day 4, trucks arriving before sunrise, workers shouting across the lot, diesel engines idling for hours, dust billowing in yellow clouds that settled over my garden, my car, my porch furniture. Once, a delivery truck blocked my entire driveway for 40 minutes. I missed a call I'd been waiting on because I couldn't hear my phone ring over the noise. I'm not a man who complains easily. I've always believed in handling things quietly, directly, person to person. So after about a week of this, I walked over. Preston Hargrove was standing near a set of architectural blueprints spread across the hood of his Mercedes. He was on the phone. One of his assistants, a nervous-looking young man in a polo shirt, saw me approaching and whispered something. Hargrove glanced over, held up a finger without looking at me, and kept talking on the phone for another 4 minutes. I counted. When he finally turned to me, it was with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Can I help you?" he said. "Hi, I'm Daniel Mercer. I live next door." I gestured toward my house. "I just wanted to come over and introduce myself, neighbor to neighbor. I also wanted to ask, respectfully, if there's any chance the construction could start a little later in the mornings. Maybe 7:30, 8 o'clock. The county noise ordinance actually requires." He cut me off. "We have permits," he said. "I understand that. I'm just saying, for the sake of the neighborhood." "Do whatever you want," he said, turning back to his blueprints. "You clearly don't know who I am." He said it the way people say things they've said 100 times before, as a dismissal, a door closing in my face. I stood there for a moment. Then I nodded slowly, thanked him for his time because my mother raised me right, and walked back to my house. I sat down on the porch, picked up my coffee, looked out at the construction equipment and the yellow dust drifting over my rose bushes. "Okay," I said quietly to no one. I didn't mean it as a threat, but looking back, maybe it was. The call came 8 days after my conversation with Hargrove. A woman from the Maple Creek HOA, a Mrs. Patricia Elms, board president, left a voicemail asking me to come in for a neighborly discussion. The way she said it, tight and rehearsed, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a discussion. This was a message. I'd been expecting something. When a man like Preston Hargrove feels challenged, even mildly, he doesn't let it go. He escalates. It's the only language power-drunk people know. I didn't go to their office. I let Mrs. Elms know politely that they were welcome to come to my home. 3 days later, 2 HOA board members showed up at my front door. Patricia Elms, a stiff woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her head, and a younger man named Gerald who kept clicking his pen and looking at his clipboard. I offered them water. They declined. I offered them seats on the porch. They sat stiffly. "Mr. Mercer," Patricia began, "we've received some concerns about your behavior regarding the construction next door. Specifically, that you've been approaching the site and causing disruptions to an authorized project." I let her finish. I've learned that the people most dangerous to themselves are the ones who talk without knowing what they're talking about. "May I ask," I said calmly, "which section of the HOA bylaws authorizes you to address that concern?" She blinked. "Excuse me. Our HOA agreement covers common areas, exterior aesthetics, lawn maintenance standards, and community conduct within designated shared spaces. A private conversation I had with a neighboring property owner about noise on his property during permitted hours, initiated by me as a resident, doesn't fall under any of those categories." Gerald stopped clicking his pen. "Furthermore," I continued, keeping my voice pleasant, "the County Construction Ordinance, Chapter 14, Section 4, specifies that residential construction must not begin before 7 a.m. and must cease by 8 p.m. on weekdays. Over the past 11 days, I have documented 14 separate instances of equipment operation beginning before 6:30 a.m. I have time-stamped recordings and a written log, if you'd like to review them." Patricia's jaw had gone slightly slack. "The HOA does not have authority to override county ordinance," I said, "nor does it have authority to discourage a resident from exercising their legal right to report ordinance violations. If the board has taken action based on a third party's request to suppress that right, that would constitute a potential breach of the board's fiduciary duty to all residents, not just the well-connected ones." There was a long silence. A car rolled slowly down the street. A bird called from the oak tree in my front yard. Patricia put her notepad back in her bag. Gerald's clipboard was in his lap, untouched. "I think," she said carefully, "we may have been given an incomplete picture of the situation." "I think so too," I agreed. They left without another word. Patricia Elms didn't look at me as she walked to her car. Gerald stared at the sidewalk. I went inside and made a fresh pot of coffee. Whatever Preston Hargrove had told them, whatever he'd promised or implied, hadn't worked out the way he'd expected. And I understood, with the certainty of a man who has dealt with a certain kind of ego before, that this made things worse. Men like Hargrove don't absorb embarrassment. They redirect it, they aim it. It was a Thursday evening. Around 7 p.m. I was in the backyard pulling weeds from around the base of the rose bushes when I heard the cars. 2 police cruisers pulling up to my house. Not speeding, just slow, deliberate, unhurried. The kind of arrival that's meant to be seen. I set down my trowel, pulled off my gardening gloves, walked around to the front of the house. 2 officers got out of the first car. A third stayed near the second vehicle. They were courteous, I'll give them that, but their body language was careful, measured. "Daniel Mercer," the first officer said. "That's me. Sir, we've received a complaint of harassment and threatening behavior from a Mr. Preston Hargrove." He's also alleged that you've been trespassing on his construction site and interfering with workers. I kept my face very still. I'd learned long ago that the moment you show emotion to an accusation is the moment you start losing the narrative. That's not accurate, I said. I visited the site once over 2 weeks ago. I introduced myself and asked about construction hours. Mr. Hargrove dismissed the conversation. I haven't returned since. Yes, sir. I understand. There's also a mention of an interaction with HOA representatives that Mr. Hargrove characterizes as hostile. The HOA came to my home. I was on my own porch. The officer nodded. There was something in his expression, a flicker of something that told me he'd heard the other side of this story, and it hadn't entirely sat right with him either. But he had a complaint. He had a name on a form. And Preston Hargrove was the kind of name that came with phone calls from people above the officer's pay grade. Sir, I need to ask you to come with us to the station to answer some questions. Am I being arrested? A pause. We'd like to bring you in voluntarily, but if you decline. No, I said. I'll come, let me lock up the house. They let me do that at least. I rode in the back of the cruiser and looked out the window at the neighborhood passing by, the oaks throwing long shadows in the evening light, the Hendersons' porch light flickering on, a kid on a bicycle turning the corner. Ordinary, quiet, beautiful. At the station, they put me in a holding room. Not a cell, not yet, but close enough. White walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, a camera mounted in the corner. I sat with my hands folded and waited. A detective came in eventually, asked questions. I answered them clearly and briefly. I requested to make a phone call. Anyone in particular? The detective asked. Yes, I said. My attorney, his name is Franklin Ware. He'll be familiar to your department. The detective looked at me for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Franklin Ware, he repeated. Tell him Daniel Mercer is here. He'll come. They put me in a holding cell at 11 p.m. The lights were harsh. The bunk was thin. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling and thought about how strange it is, how remarkably strange, that the quieter a man tries to live, the louder other people want to make his life. I thought about Preston Hargrove in his glass and steel mansion. Satisfied, probably. Certain he'd solved the problem the way he always solved problems, by applying pressure until something gave. He had no idea what was about to crack. It started, I'm told, with the background check. Standard procedure when someone is brought in on a complaint, especially one made by a person of Hargrove's profile. The department runs a preliminary background on the accused. A formality, mostly. A way to establish who they're dealing with. My name returned some interesting results. Daniel Mercer. Clean criminal record. No priors, no incidents, no flags of any kind. But attached to my name were a series of registered business entities. Mercer Capital Holdings, Crestline Properties Group, Blue Ridge Industrial, 3 mid-sized manufacturing firms, a logistics company, and a commercial real estate portfolio spread across 9 states. Total estimated holdings, somewhere north of $200 million. I also sat on the board of the County Hospital Foundation. I'd quietly funded the renovation of the East Wing 2 years ago. The detective who had run my name recognized one of the board members listed in my file, his daughter's cardiologist. By 6 a.m., word had moved up the chain. By 7 a.m., the duty captain had made 2 phone calls he hadn't planned on making that morning. By 8 a.m., Franklin Ware arrived at the station. Franklin is 61 years old, immaculately dressed, and has the calm, unhurried energy of a man who has never in his adult life been surprised by anything. He sat across from me in the holding room and set his briefcase on the table. Daniel, he said. Franklin. You look remarkably well rested for a man who spent the night in a cell. I slept fine, I said. He laid out the situation with the efficiency of someone describing a mildly interesting weather forecast. The complaint against me had been reviewed. The evidence supporting it was, in Franklin's words, aggressively thin. The on-site construction logs showed no record of trespassing. The HOA representatives, when contacted, had already quietly walked back their characterization of our meeting. The two officers who'd brought me in had noted in their report that I had been fully cooperative and non-confrontational. I was released before 10 a.m., but by then, other things had already been set in motion. Because while Franklin was handling my release, other people were handling their panic. Patricia Elms had apparently called an emergency board meeting the night before, after someone on the board had recognized my name in connection with the funding of a local arts center. The HOA's operating account, it turned out, received a small but meaningful annual contribution from a nonprofit I'd helped establish 8 years ago. The board had been approving grants without fully reading the donor disclosures. They hadn't known. Now they did. And Preston Hargrove, I heard this secondhand, but from a reliable source, had received a call from his own attorney around 6:30 in the morning. Something about a zoning variance he needed for the rear portion of his construction project. A variance that required sign-off from the county land use board. A board whose chair, it turned out, had been my college roommate for 3 years and remained a close friend. I didn't make any calls. I want to be clear about that. I didn't pull any strings or ask any favors. I simply existed. But when you've spent 30 years quietly building things, relationships, institutions, goodwill, sometimes your existence alone is enough to rearrange the room. By noon, Hargrove's assistant had left 2 messages on my personal cell phone. By 2 p.m., Patricia Elms had sent a formal written apology on HOA letterhead, hand-delivered to my door. By 4 p.m., Hargrove himself had called. I let it go to voicemail. Mr. Mercer, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence, reduced to something careful and hollow. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding. I'd like to sit down with you, clear the air. I believe we can resolve this as gentlemen. I listened to the message twice. Then I set my phone down and went out to water my roses. I wasn't ready to be a gentleman yet. Not quite. People assume revenge looks like fire. A confrontation, raised voices and pointed fingers, something dramatic and cathartic that you'd see in a movie. That's not how I do things. I waited 3 days before I responded to Hargrove. During those 3 days, I made a few quiet calls, not threats, not demands. Just conversations with people I'd known for years. A journalist who covered local development for the city paper, a city council member who sat on the planning commission, the president of the neighborhood association for the 3 streets adjacent to ours. I also filed a formal complaint with the county code enforcement office, a detailed, documented, time-stamped report of every pre-dawn construction violation over the previous 3 weeks. I attached the audio recordings I'd made from my back porch. I attached the written log. I was thorough because I'm always thorough. Then I agreed to meet Hargrove. He suggested his office downtown, 42nd floor, sweeping views of the city. I said no. I suggested my house, my porch. He arrived in the Mercedes, alone this time, which told me something. Men like Hargrove bring audiences when they're winning. They come alone when they're not. He looked different in person than he had that first day. The tan was the same. The watch was the same. But something had gone out of him, that particular energy of a man who has never been told no and doesn't believe it's possible. He settled into the porch chair across from me and tried to arrange his face into something reasonable. Daniel, he said, trying out my first name to establish familiarity. I want to start by saying, what happened was not what I intended. What did you intend? I asked. He shifted. I just wanted the project to proceed without interference. You bribed HOA representatives to intimidate a neighbor, I said. Then you filed a false police complaint that resulted in my wrongful detention. I kept my voice perfectly level. That's what happened. He opened his mouth, closed it. I'm not here to negotiate, I said. I'm here because you asked to come, and I wanted you to understand something clearly. I looked at him, not with anger, just with the kind of steadiness that comes from not needing anything from someone. Everything you did, the HOA call, the police complaint, it's documented. My attorney has copies. The county has the code violation report. There are 3 reporters who have asked me to comment on a story about development pressure and HOA corruption in suburban neighborhoods. I haven't commented yet. He sat very still. I also want you to know that the zoning variance you need for the rear extension of your project, the one that's currently under informal review, is going to receive very careful scrutiny. Not because I made any calls, but because code enforcement tends to look closely at projects that have documented ordinance violations. Funny how that works. What do you want? He said. His voice was quiet now, no performance in it. 3 things, I said. First, construction begins no earlier than 7:30 a.m. and ends by 6:30 p.m. Second, you issue a written statement to the HOA board clarifying that your complaint against me was based on a misunderstanding and withdrawing any characterization of my conduct as hostile or unlawful. Third, you make a donation, a real one, not a tax maneuver, to the neighborhood community fund. The amount is up to you, but I'll know if it's sincere or not. He stared at me for a long moment. That's it. He said. That's it, I said. I'm not interested in destroying you, Mr. Hargrove. I'm not interested in lawsuits or press coverage or making your life difficult. I'm interested in my garden, my coffee, and my quiet. I'd like those things back. He nodded. Something in him seemed to exhale, that rigid, armored certainty deflating like a slow tire. He agreed to all 3. The written statement came 2 days later. The donation, which turned out to be more than I expected, arrived within the week. Construction, since then, has started at 7:30 on the dot. The HOA held a board meeting shortly after, at which Patricia Elms formally acknowledged that the board had allowed itself to be influenced by a third party in a manner inconsistent with its obligations to all residents. 2 board members resigned. Patricia Elms did not, but she's been unusually deferential at every meeting since. Hargrove's mansion is still being built. It's going to be enormous, 3 stories, a pool, a guest house. It'll cast a shadow over my yard in the late afternoon. I've already planned which shade-tolerant plants I'll put in. We don't wave to each other. We don't speak. But last week I was on the porch with my coffee when his Mercedes pulled in next door and he glanced over as he got out. I held up my mug just slightly. He looked away quickly, got his briefcase, and went inside. I sat there a while longer, listening to the birds in the oak tree, watching the light move through the roses my wife planted. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the full story, whether I regret not going harder, filing the lawsuits, going to the press, making it public and ugly and final. I always tell them the same thing. The most powerful thing a person can do is make someone understand without question, without any room for doubt, that you could have destroyed them and you chose not to. That's not mercy. That's a lesson that lives with them forever. I picked up my coffee. The morning was quiet. The roses were blooming. Some things are worth more than being right. They're worth being at peace. End.